Chris Doherty.
Hello, Chris. David Bolton calling.
Hi, David. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Everything all right for our conversation today?
Oh, reasonably, yes.
Okay, good. Thank you for making the time.
No, of course.
Appreciate it. As I said, I'd like to actually do a kind of an interview with you during this first part of the conversation and tee that into a videotaped interview the next time we're in Washington.
Okay.
Is that all right?
Yeah, I didn't know it was going to be an interview today, but I will gamely at least begin.
Okay, all right. So I am recording this conversation. Transcripts are, parts of it may be used in various ways relative to articles, books, websites. If there's at any time you want to go off the record, I'll just stop it, no problem, and I'll give you a complete transcript of everything that we converse about.
Great.
Is that all fair?
Yes.
Okay, good. How much time do we have today, Chris?
Probably half an hour.
Okay, all right, good. Maybe we could start with a brief sketch of you and your job and what motivates you to do it.
Well, I'm the program director for the Reading First program here in the Department of Education. I started a day before the President signed the No Child Left Behind Act into law on January 8th, 2002. Reading First is a $6 billion program that is part of No Child Left Behind. It's a kindergarten through third grade reading program. Prior to coming to the department, I was the executive director of a not-for-profit organization in Baltimore, Maryland that managed public schools and implemented curriculum and also did a little bit of teacher training work. So the link there, and also to previous work that I did, is through scientifically based reading instruction, the kinds of reading programs that are aligned with the 5 components of reading as outlined by the National Reading Panel report, and that that are aligned with not just in the sense of the program itself, but the assessments that guide instructional decisions and the professional development that go through the year. So it's something that I've been working on and working with for several years, and Reading First really is the flagship of programs that try to make sure that all instructional decisions made for kindergartners through third graders in reading are based on the guiding research.
Excellent, excellent. And so what would you say motivates you personally? Why did you?
Well, it really is both the most obvious and the most important motivation. It's knowing how intoxicating and how powerful it is when little kids are exposed to good, solid instruction from an early age. They can make such life-changing and wonderful achievement gains from their first days of school. There's really nothing like having a child gain command of reading in kind of a very systematic and confidence-building way that opens up all the doors imaginable to those little kids at a very early age. I mean, it's to be part of that on a small scale is absolutely wonderful and life-affirming, and to be part of it on a larger scale is just that much more rewarding. It's as good as it gets, being part of helping bring effective, solid instructional techniques and programs and materials to little kids across the country. I can't think of anything more worthwhile or more exciting.
Well, we're in complete alignment. That's what motivates me too.
Oh, absolutely. And as grandiose on one hand as what I said was, it's
an understatement.
Understated, exactly right. It's actually an understatement.
Yeah, it's so hard for some people to grasp how fundamentally central this reading issue is, because it's not just about reading.
No.
It's so much deeper and more pervasive in the infrastructure of the consciousness of the child.
It is.
And everything that happens to them.
It absolutely is. It's building. Yes, it's reading. Yes, it's learning how to read. But it's building the infrastructure and the hardwiring of that little guy's brain that then can be used to just to build the rocket ship that goes to Mars someday.
Yeah. Excellent. Good. I always like to find the heart.
Oh.
I'm glad to find yours. Thank you.
Oh boy, I tell you, nothing would rather be doing than working on this Reading First program.
Yep. Well, let me take a couple minutes and give you a sense of my frame of reference in all of this, and without imposing on you, some sense of what I think you're up to as I understand it from my conversations with Dr. Whitehurst, Dr. Lyon, Wendorf, and a number of other folks involved in the other side, or the science side of all of this. I mean, one of the things that's become clear is that when you look at the afflictions that most endanger children's opportunities in school and life today, reading improficiency is really at the top of the list.
Yes, it is.
And that according to our current data models, which are quite open to lots of different criticism, but even if you roughly ballpark them, we're talking about most of our children are not reading proficiently, and as a consequence of that are in various degrees of serious psychological, intellectual, economic, academic danger.
Yes.
That in addition to this, I mean, we're putting together a table that shows the various things that children born today are at risk of in terms of what can do their life harm as they develop. And the reading challenge is putting more children at risk than everything else combined.
Yes, it's as big a problem as there is.
Yes, and the cost to the nation, as Dr. Whitehurst said, is actually greater than the war on crime, drugs, and terror combined.
I don't disagree. The only word that came to mind as you were starting your sentence was incalculable.
Yes, it's yes. But and for those that want to see it in economic terms,
right,
we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars in direct or related costs to this problem.
Absolutely.
So we have this as a backdrop. We see that our children are at great risk about this. It's both this phenomenal enabler of all that's positive that can come from education, the infrastructure from which to have a good education and to be self-reflexive, critically self-reflexive. So many of these things are built on how well they develop these early reading skills. And on the other hand, if they don't, the collateral damage, the damage that's associated with the reading improficiency is staggering.
Yeah.
So with that as a background, the scientists have come to basically understand that only about 5% of children are neurobiologically challenged about reading. In other words, that only about 5% of children have some innate difficulty with reading, and that the remaining 95% or so could read if they were taught correctly.
Right.
So that means that all of this money, all of these tragedies, what's happening to children is a consequence of the fact that we're not doing it right. It's not them.
It's not them.
Right?
It's not the kids.
It's not the kids. It's our collective understanding and the way that we think about and the way that we instruct children.
Yes.
Yes. Enter where we're both focusing now.
Yeah.
So, like I said, most of our children are at risk. They're at risk because we don't understand something that's critical in this process, and there's a whole lot of mythical ideas about what to do. And at the same time, over the past 20 years, a lot of research has developed both by, Reed Lyon's shop at the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, and also by brain scientists working on all different dimensions of this problem, that we're now realizing that this is a radically unnatural act. It's a technological interface process, and we can't just, dump it on the kids like dropping a piano on them.
That's right. Right. It's not like learning to talk.
It's not like learning to talk. It's not like learning to walk. There's no instincts involved in this.
Right.
Right?
It's pretty arbitrary to say that squiggle makes this sound. You have to be taught it.
Right. Right. So we now have this challenge that says it is a technological code process that requires a systematic way to learn into it. There are some children that they're between their brain frequency and the degree of oral language exposure they've had and the kind of complexity of concepts they've dealt with, have the building block foundations to take off in reading and do pretty well regardless of the instruction, or less dependent on the instruction. But for the majority of our children, obviously the 64% nationally that are below proficiency in reading, we could say that the degree of systematized instruction is what's missing.
Yes.
Okay. So with that all as a background, we start to move into the what is it that's animating the No Child Left Behind Reading First initiatives. And what my sense is, and again, this is just to give you a place to take off from, is that we realized that though the ideal situation would be to bring teachers and administrators and the whole school and parent community into a deeper understanding of this and bring about some alignment in behavior based on the depth of that understanding. But in the absence of that, as restricted and inhibited by all of the different philosophies and belief mechanisms in play, the government has decided this is too important and has decided to develop institutional incentives and structures to move education into focusing here in a different way.
Yes, I agree with that.
Okay, and so the consequence of that has been the development of this legislation that you are overseeing the administration of, which has created both incentives and penalties to focus educators into this space and to incent them to use the practices that have been affirmed by research and evidence to be working.
That's right, and it's first of all, with the first year of No Child Left Behind and the Reading First portion of it, it tripled the amount of federal funding for kindergarten through third grade reading programs. I mean, just as a mathematical fact, the first year of No Child Left Behind just more than tripled, actually, the amount of funding at the federal level. So the conservative estimate of what the funding will be for Reading First alone over the life of the grant is $6 billion. Now, that's a very serious amount of money in relative terms to what's been spent in the past, and moreover, it's significantly more money, but for plans that were reviewed and re-reviewed and re-reviewed with expert panels in a way that no other federal program had done, and that's testament to how much more rigor this program is requiring. In other words, some of the more recent federal reading efforts have had sections from the states that touched on the research. States rather, would write elegies to the research as if to check the box that says, yes, we're aware that there's research that guides reading instruction, but that was Section 1, and Section 2 was their plan that didn't show any understanding of the research. It wasn't guided by the research. They used assessments that didn't tell them much of anything, and it didn't guide what actually happened to children in the classroom. This effort is very different from that, and yes, it's a lot more money, and yes, it has a lot more direction from the Department of Ed, but more than anything, the actual plans, the actual activities that are going to happen in the classroom and in the elementary school buildings is really driven by the convergent research in a way that has never happened before. It just simply hasn't. It bears out any kind of look at what happened before and now. And one example, not to get too quickly into the specifics, but one example, one very kind of distinctive example is different children are in different places at different times and therefore need different things. Now, it's particularly outrageous that some people had labeled Reading First a one-size-fits-all approach, because anyone at all familiar with scientifically based reading instruction would yell from the rooftops what the research indicates, in many different ways, is how one size doesn't fit all. That different children need different things. They might all be 5 years old. They might all be 6 years old, but they have different strengths and different weaknesses. What you need to tell you what any particular child needs are valid and reliable assessments that say this child is good, or is this child is decoding her letters well and consistently, but she has no fluency and therefore no comprehension, or might have vocabulary issues. You need things that help tease these things out, rather than just kind of, can the child read or not, yes or no, like a light switch.
Right.
And that was too often what was happening, that people would say, well, they'll get it. They'll get it. Maybe next year they'll get it. Maybe next year they'll get it. In a horrible mix of bad instruction and social promotion, what it led to was ever larger, older, more depressed, and more demoralized children that never did get it. Never ever did get it, and they left school not having gotten it. The Reading First approach, and you could just say the scientifically based reading approach, not necessarily just the program named Reading First, it says when the little guys come in at the beginning of the year, or in a very highly mobile environment like typifies so many of our schools, the first day of that kid's year, whether it's a Tuesday in February when they just transferred schools or whatever else, find out what that kid can do. Sit down and have a quick and dirty but fast, reliable mechanism to say whether that kid can decode or not, whether they're just guessing at words, just any number of things that determine where a child should be placed to meet his or her needs. So much of that never happened. And now it's happening across the country in systematic ways. Now, a key thing that is all too often overlooked is when people start to get their heads around what the National Reading Panel report said and the importance of the 5 components of reading, awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension, what they can't overlook is that it isn't just the presence of those 5 things, because they're not really things, right?
Right.
But it's that the instructional package of programs and materials and assessments, that they have an explicit and systematic approach to those things. Too often, if we're not careful, people will say, here's a book, and in that book there are the 5 components. That's not necessary and sufficient at all. It's teachers who are trained and supported, who know how to use assessments, who know how to give instruction. It's extremely complex. That's why it was so just antithetically opposed to reality when people would say that Reading First is a one-size-fits-all. It's 10,000 times more complicated than that, because it has to be, because every kid, it can need different things at different times. But I hope I didn't go off on a tangent.
No, not at all. Not at all. That's pretty much the heart of it from my point of view as well. I mean, yes, children come with an entirely different profile of readiness.
Yes, they do. And you know what? And that, just jumping right back into that. But absolutely right. Too often, I mean, and this is it's going to sound overstated, but it really isn't, that little kids would come in at the first day of kindergarten and they'd be sat down as a group, and that's okay, it's the first day of kindergarten, we're going to start now, and then they'd just, get this kind of instruction in quotation marks where they didn't know whether that 5-year-old, they didn't know anything about what that 5-year-old knew or could do. They made huge assumptions that were almost always detrimental to the kid, that assumed, okay, you're 5, so implicitly we're assuming that you must know some stuff. Well, what happens when they don't know near 100% of that stuff? What if they know 20% of that stuff? The kid is behind on day 1, and he keeps getting behind, and he gets further and further behind, and there's no attempt to figure out what exactly he doesn't know, and how, once you do find out what he knows, how to accelerate that kid, so that, because almost from day 1, if you didn't know what you were supposed to know on day 1, you're already behind, and 2 years into it, you need to gain, 4 years growth in 2 years to get back to 0. And none of these programs or no, I shouldn't say that, but by and large, the approach was not to systematically find out where children were, to teach them at that level, and to get them where they needed to go. It just didn't happen.
To actually have a more granular assessment instrument that has a correlation to a menu of approved evidence-based practices that can be focused specifically on the subpar development of the various components that are required for reading on a per-child basis.
That's exactly right. Boy, that's beautifully stated, and it's exactly right. Because, and another thing to point out with Reading First, across so many of these issues, to go from, more granular to more general, it is not a remedial program for kids that are falling behind. The good instruction is good instruction. It isn't a matter of there's one type of good instruction for these kids and a completely different type of good instruction for these kids. When kids come to an instructional environment for the first time, they need to be quickly and reliably assessed to know where they are. But that doesn't mean that if the 5-year-old is coming in reading at the late first grade level, well, that's a wonderful thing to know. Put that 5-year-old in a reading group, a small reading group that challenges her. Don't just give her, sounds and letters because that's what you think you should start with. It goes in both directions. A third grader who's been fooling people because he's been in 10 schools in 4 years and he can guess the high-frequency words like what, which, that, and things like that. He's a word guesser, and that teacher needs to find out on day one he's a word guesser. And although he's 5'6" in third grade, what he needs is phonics and phonemic awareness help first and foremost. They need to know that just as much as they need to know that this 5-year-old is really a late first grade, early second grade reader, and let's find a reading group for her that challenges her and doesn't make her bored in class. I mean, it goes in all those directions.
Right. Excellent. Thank you. Of course, connected to all of this, but that we didn't explicitly speak of, although you referred to it a little bit, is that the emerging science of the affect system and emotions are saying that once shame starts to creep in to the learning to read process, it's consuming the cognitive bandwidth that you need to read. So we've got to change the environment so that in addition to meeting these children in a more granular way with respect to where they are developmentally in all of this, that we envelop them in a pretty shame-free environment to not allow their affective response to the feeling of not being good enough at this to be so undermining.
Yes, certainly. And I think that there's definitely many ways to do that, taking into consideration absolutely your point that you want to create an environment where the children can learn, they can catch up, and they can they cannot be. They certainly don't get stigmatized, or they don't get stigmatized while they're doing just the kind of catching up that they need to do. Absolutely. And one of the and I know this is a more specific part of your question, but in settings in the classroom and elsewhere, especially in the K-3 environment, which we know is only part of the reading environment that can go. I mean, there are poor readers right up through their last day of public school, but the engagement can be almost immediate. In other words, when a child who has even experienced real, lack of success in a school setting, when they get the kind of instruction that they need, the positive effects is near instantaneous. Now,
they can feel the feedback coming from themselves that they're being successful. It opens up their attention and remotivates and detoxes the shame.
It really does. Now, I certainly wouldn't want to overstate it in the sense that it can, erase years of demoralization. I'm not saying that, but at the same time, it's amazing how positive and how quick the reaction can be to even children who have had significant lack of success in school when they realize that they're doing something they haven't done before. And it's so different from just the empty praise of good job, junior, good job, junior, good job, junior, which is one thing.
It's not an artificial self-esteem pump.
No, he knows he just read a page of text that he couldn't read before. He knows he's breaking the code, and that's, you can have that and a pat on the back, and that's and both of them are better than just a pat on the back.
Absolutely, excellent. Well, we've only scratched the surface, and it's 5 minutes before the end of your 30-minute allotment.
You're good. You're good to keep your eye on that. That's very thoughtful.
Yeah, I would like to be able to continue this conversation. In particular, I'm interested in looking at this from your lens in more detail as far as the structure of how you're administering this.
Oh, boy.
And also, I mean, one of the things that Children of the Code is trying to do is to say, look, there's a lot of different tribes at war in this space right now. There's teachers that feel that there's a kind of a draconian control coming from Washington. They don't understand because they are not connected at the same depth level to the research and evidence and what it's pointing to, and their experience is based on dealing with these children and wanting to feel good about themselves.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, there's a big mess going on in here that we want to do is connect the dots for parents and teachers so that they understand. I mean, I envision you as being part of this group who recognize just how fundamental this is, like the beginning of our conversation, in terms of the future of the country, the economics, and the suffering and opportunity of all of our children. This is the fulcrum.
This is it. Yeah, there's no more important work being done, more beneficial to the nation. Nothing compares to this.
I totally
really
agree. And I don't think most people get that, and there's a lot of things they don't get, and that's the mission of the Children of the Code, is to bridge these gaps. So I'd like to continue our conversation, if that's possible, with you in the near future. Tell me what.
Absolutely. You know, I'll even leave you with this thought, because I was hanging on your every word, and I do not deny when I think you use the term tribes, and there's various kind of clash points or flash points, you might say, although both seem to work. And one thing, not in a Pollyanna way, but one thing that I found over the last 22 months, which is when the bill was signed into law, and a lot of that was kind of spade work prior to having the program be something that the states could apply for. I mean, while the program was really on its first legs. One thing that I've been very encouraged by, knowing about both reading wars and about state, local, and federal interactions, many times I've been part of workshops and conferences and meetings and informal get-togethers where the leading experts on reading first and scientifically based reading research kind of elucidate some of these points. And people who are sitting in the audience or shortly thereafter who might have thought that they were about to hear the voice of the other side react overwhelmingly with comments like, what part of that was I supposed to hate?
Yeah.
That when people who are girded for battle, really, almost because of things that they think, the conflicts that they assume they're going to have, when they get into the 90-minute, 2-hour, 3-hour kind of elaboration on what some of this means at the classroom level and what some of this means for teachers and kids, they really react with, was that the guy that I was supposed to hate? Because, gosh, I really found what he said compelling and largely reinforcing of what I've been thinking for my 30 years in education. They're not sure, oftentimes, what part they're supposed to disagree with, because it is so powerful when it's laid out in an environment of, this is what it means for the kids, this is why we do this is why we do that. There's actually wonderfully, on the teacher level, oftentimes less pushback than both sides are prepared for.
Right.
Which, like I say, not to make that sound Pollyanna, but we've actually found it to be the message is its own kind of wins on its own merit a lot of times.
Well, one of the things that we're trying to do with this, and I want to be mindful of your time, I got a minute left, I think, is that people don't understand. When people get caught in the dichotomies and polarities, they really don't realize that both phonics and whole language are compensations for a technical mess in the code.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so one of the things that we're doing and having great success with is taking people back on a ride through the development history of the code. How did it come to be the way that it is?
Yeah.
To dispel its mythology and to make it really clear that what we're talking about is most of our children are having their lives mangled because of a technological artifact. And learning how to relate to it. And because we don't put it in the right perspective, and because it's so confusing to parents and teachers, it gives room for all kinds of pseudoscience things to plug in.
Yes, that's right. Oh gosh, that's absolutely true. So I look forward to continuing this discussion.
Okay, good. Me too. You want to send me some? Thank you so much for making the time to talk again.
Of course.
And thanks for the last conversation. I really enjoyed it, and appreciate your time and enthusiasm and where your heart's coming from and all that you're bringing to this.
Oh, great. Well, thanks. I enjoyed it myself. I mean, next to I guess second only to my kids, I'm always eager to talk about reading first.
Good, good. I want to just preface our takeoff into this part of the conversation with again saying we're recording the conversation.
Yep.
And all of that relative to the interview.
Great.
Good. All right. Thanks for acknowledging that. I think last time we did a pretty good job at the altitude that we can climb in this kind of time frame about the general dimension of this problem, why it's so important, both to the kind of fate of the children as they develop and also to our nation as a whole. We started to didn't get far with the kind of specifics of the reading first, the structure, the incentive structures of reading first and how what the strategy is underneath them. And I wanted to talk about that today, and also about what you think your biggest challenge is. I mean, here we are, we're recognizing how fundamentally important reading is. You've got these resources at your back and a mandate to proceed with, and this huge institutional monstrosity called, the United States education system and all of its variances, that you're trying to move into a new future about reading. And what's the biggest challenges you face to do that?
Oh, well, I think, to my mind, the biggest challenge, which is really a set of challenges that are interrelated, is that this is really hard, which I know at the one hand sounds like a restatement of the question, but I think even once teachers and administrators, in that order, teachers and building level administrators and then up from there, make the conscious decision to implement rigorous, scientifically based reading instructional programs in their schools, that's a big step, and oftentimes it's a bunch of little steps taken together. But even once they do that, the ongoing nature of teaching kids well and giving kids what they need when they need it, it never really gets easy. I think teachers get better at it, schools get better at it, but the challenges are always there. It's tiring. It's hard to do. It's never ending. It's really quite difficult. That directly speaks to the kind of ongoing professional development and ongoing monitoring and ongoing support that make up Reading First. One thing that you'll hear frequently from teachers and state and district level folks is Reading First is not a summer institute and then you're a Reading First teacher or a Reading First school. It's absolutely something that might be called a summer institute, followed by a building coach and weekly discussions of the data and where the kids are and who's progressing well and who's not progressing well. But by its very nature, it's not a matter of getting it right, making the perfect design, and then
replicating it mindlessly.
And replicating, exactly right. In the sense that, any kind of manufacturing analogy is difficult because these are kids. But even at its highest level, it's not really able to be made because you can't have all the best and the brightest get involved in the design and then say, okay, we've spent 5 years on the design, but each million copies is only going to be the touch of a button here, because in every classroom there are the 28 or 32 or 17 if you're lucky, 21 if you're lucky, little guys that constantly need different things. So I think the ongoing challenge is not getting people to acknowledge, I think, that changes need to be made. I think that's not among the biggest challenges. I don't think it's even then educating and persuading either neutral or fairly neutral audiences. I think it's, once convinced, it's supporting the classroom teachers and the building principals and the building coaches, because this is harder than the alternative. I mean, again, at a very high altitude, I think way above elements of the reading wars, part of the reason that the status quo has gotten to be the status quo is it's generally a lot easier to teach a classroom full of kids the way that comes most naturally to that teacher and hope for the best, as opposed to a much more rigorous, a much more data-based, a much more kid-by-kid level way to teach, which is what scientifically based reading instruction is all about.
Excellent. So when you look at the percentage of teachers that are out there, it seems to me that what we're talking about is a social educational project at one level, to get people to understand the need to rethink and reformulate their own sense of what reading is, and have the internal sense of conviction that it takes to proceed down this path of using this more measured instructional approach than going with their intuitive feel-good.
Yes, I agree with that setup, and I also think that what has exacerbated that already existing kind of tension is many teacher education programs that also seem to reinforce the more kind of philosophically based approaches to teaching kids that haven't borne results over the last generations. They have been overly reliant on this hoped-for turning point where a child who has shown no measurable progress in learning to read will suddenly get it and then become an avid reader. Those hopes have not been borne out at all, and teacher education programs in all too many cases have not prepared teachers who want to be good teachers, who are eager to get into the profession, but then aren't given the skills that they need to be able to make a difference in the classroom the next year when they leave academia and go and have 20, 25 kids in front of them. Unfortunately, much of what Reading First is focused on is providing professional development to teachers who ideally would leave their teacher education institutions almost ready to go the next day and to teach. Now, any profession is going to need ongoing professional development and training and more specific types of workshops. At the same time, all too often the teachers entering the profession, in a Reading First environment anyway, need to be retrained almost from zero rather than being able to leverage much of what they just spent 4 years learning.
Right.
So that's a really big challenge, and luckily the Reading First legislation realized this, and it unprecedentedly set aside 20% of the total grant money. So that would be, roughly $1.2 billion over the current life of the grant, to be used by the states at the state level, specifically for professional development and technical assistance. Because what they knew was they weren't assuming that freshly minted teachers from many places would be able to walk into the classroom and teach in a Reading First environment, but rather they would need to get specific training in addition to what they got at college.
Excellent. Excellent. So in addition to a kind of a orientation experience that orients them differently to understanding the challenge of learning to read so that they have a different attention span that they can bring to that, a different quality of tracking the children, they also need a kind of a performance support system that they can stay continually plugged into to continue to learn and refine how they apply the instructional strategies and components that are available on the menu, so to speak, to the individual children in an ever more fine way.
That's exactly right. There's a whole host of different types of reading first professional development. Oftentimes it's focused on the instructional program itself. Oftentimes it's on the assessments that are given to determine what children need and when. So there's a whole range of different things that the well-supported, well-trained reading first teacher would constantly need, and not just as a function of trying to, say, overcome a lacking teacher preparation background, but even the prototypical teacher that had a good experience in college and was well prepared, that teacher as well would still need a whole host of ongoing support because of all the elements involved. It gets back to the whole kind of biggest single challenge, which is the ongoing nature of all this. That you're never really done. You're never really all. You never really, which is kind of daunting when you think about it. I mean, you can always get better. Teachers can always do more. Teachers can always be more in tune with what every one of their students need. So it's really kind of, like I say, daunting.
Right. There's an infinite descent into more subtlety.
Exactly right, and I think the teachers know that, and they're prepared to have it be a constant career-long improvement, especially when they see the difference that they're making, and they know that they're now trying to go from being an A teacher to an A+ teacher, or maybe even the A+ is never even realizable, because the best teachers are the ones that know the sky's the limit for their kids. So you can't reach the sky, but you can try to accelerate your kids and have second graders reading 5th grade texts and have first graders reading 3rd grade texts and really enjoying it. So that it's both exhilarating and, on a Friday afternoon, very exhausting.
Yeah, right.
The rest of a well-earned rest, but rest nevertheless is needed on a Friday afternoon.
Are you in the process of developing some kind of a comprehensive teacher web interface to help them get more detailed performance support information and match it against profiles of children based on assessments? And are you moving in that direction?
And was part of your question web-based?
Web-based, or some other thing that they can get at with, relative ease without having to climb too many ladders or leave?
On different levels, we are involved in developing those. One of the places would be, we recently signed a contract with a national center for reading first technical assistance. We're proud of that because it's again, like so many things in this program, it's unprecedented. We have a contract with there are 3 regional centers, one in Florida, one in Texas, and one in Oregon, that together have national reach that is absolutely meant to help in every way imaginable states, districts, schools, and teachers as they implement the Reading First program across the nation. So absolutely, yes, the raison d'etre of that center is supporting teachers as they go from, and because the context that the National Center exists in is all states have their approved plans. It's not it's not a monitoring function. It's not a compliance function. It's just, as the title suggests, it's technical assistance.
It's performance support.
It's performance support. And there's no, it's for Mrs. Jones, who wants to get better at reaching her second graders in asking inference questions based on reading comprehension passages, from that to a state director who wants to train all teachers at one time on how to use a new assessment, but she wants to do it in a relatively efficient manner during the summer. I mean, it's all those things and 100 more examples. So one of those examples, no doubt, would be presumably a web-based way to bring teachers along, because as proud as we are of having a national center that has 3 campuses, almost any state, save a few small East Coast ones, is looking at distance learning for hard-to-reach teachers and hard-to-reach kind of communities, to make sure that not every community needs to have, quote-unquote, an out-of-town professional to come in and say, this is something you might consider. Alaska is an obvious example of places that might take advantage of higher-end materials that have been developed over time and then placed on the web for mass use.
Right. I mean, ultimately, you can almost envision this getting to a point where there's almost case-based reasoning tools working with individual children profiles and helping to inform the teacher to, what to be paying more attention to, not so much to be conscripting them to robotic performance, but to be informing them and getting more subtly aware of what's happening.
Yes. That brings up the issue of, too often, I think, in the past, educational professional development has been too broad and too vague and too fuzzy, so that even places where districts have succeeded in, say, carving out 8 professional development days for all of its kindergarten teachers, let's say, too often, I think those hard-won professional development days are then filled up with very generic kind of professional development. 7 habits of highly successful people.
Right. Well, the teachers are saying this stuff doesn't talk to me or speak to me in terms of what's actually happening in the classroom. It's kind of a perfunctory renewal stamp I need.
That's exactly right. And my experience is that they'll go to that first one, and because they want someone or some ones to help them be a better teacher the next week in their classroom, if they get the tell me how you're feeling about being a teacher kind of professional development, they won't go back. Or they'll go back, but they'll be disengaged and they'll be correcting papers in the back of the room. One of the things that we really are excited about with Reading First is the focus of Reading First on the 5 components of reading instruction, of measuring how any child is stacking up with those and what she might need at certain points. It's very specific. It's absolutely about reading, and depending on the specific case, you have real meat on the bones to talk about, rather than fluffier, harder to categorize trainings that oftentimes teachers who went in highly desirous of getting useful information walk out having no ability to say what it is they supposedly just learned.
Right.
Whereas in a Reading First context, if you're having a training, you might have a training on comprehension strategies for kids reading at the 3rd grade level. That's pretty specific. You might have phonemic awareness instruction for entering kindergartners who can't hear the differences between sounds or aren't aware of stopping between sounds. Any number of things. When the beauty of having a body of research that has clearly said what constitutes effective instruction is that you can drill down deeper into those areas rather than trying to go 100 miles wide and an inch deep when 95 of those miles are not what get kids to read.
This comes back to the correspondence between the granularity of assessment and how that maps over to a menu of resources to support the teacher focusing on working what the assessment is pointing to.
Yes, exactly right. Exactly right. If one of the things, and again, in an absolutely unrehearsed way, of course, because this whole conversation is, one of the beauties of Reading First, and it's a real saving grace, and it's another example of of being the anti-one-size-fits-all.
Right.
If a child comes in, whether that child is a 5-year-old kindergartner or an 8 or 9-year-old second or third grader who has just transferred in, if they're given, which would be definitional in a reading first school, if they're given right away some valid and reliable assessments that help that teacher and that, say, building coordinator know where the student is at that moment, they can find maybe they test right the heck out of the whole program. You know, that they're reading well beyond a third grade level, and so that's as relevant to know for an incoming second grader as it is to know that second grader doesn't know that print goes from left to right.
Yeah.
I mean, too much, I think, not too much, but oftentimes the examples will be the 8 and 9-year-olds who have been, you know, getting by because they're not troublemakers, but they have almost no ability to decode at all, and they're in third grade. Well, similarly, it's important that for other kids in a school-wide environment to know if you've got kindergartners and first graders, for whatever reason, that know how to decode, that can read with fluency, that can read with comprehension, give them material that is going to challenge them and excite them, even if they're only 6.
Right, and it comes back to how relevant the challenge is to their development at the building block level and their interests.
Exactly right.
So you're talking about orchestrating a very subtle takeoff ramp.
Exactly right, and part of this is it's understandable that there could be some confusion because I've used the word assessment many times, and that is the right word. At the same time, other people will correctly use the term assessment, and what they mean is some assessment that takes 2 days to give, that's given in the spring, that determines what, you know, how the school is doing, right?
Yeah, well, the assessment has to be built into the instruction, ultimately.
Right, or it's, you know, it's a real quick and dirty thing that lets someone know, okay, this child just read this entire passage. They answered seven questions without hesitation on it. This is not challenging enough material. Or, in a way that is never meant to stigmatize a child, to give a child, an 8-year-old new student, an assessment, and they found out this child is a complete and utter non-reader.
Right.
That has nothing to do with the number 2 pencils and testing on hot days in the spring. That's a different kind of assessment that is looking at other things. You know, we're in a reading first environment. We're talking about, okay, you know, Philip Jones has just walked in. Where do we put Philip? What do we do to make him a great reader right away? And too often in the highly mobile schools, Philip Jones comes in, and because he's 8, he goes one place, or because he's 5, he goes another place, and they're just getting deeper and deeper into unfulfilling, unsatisfying school experiences when, if there were a valid and reliable assessment that can be administered either by the classroom teacher or someone else in the building who knows how to do it and what the results mean, that child can be quickly put into a group where he or she gets just what they need, and the whole trajectory has changed.
Right, and that's where it's heading. I clearly get that. And there's problems with it now where I just went to a meeting where a little girl was having some phonemic awareness issues. Even though her interest level, she was pulling through it. She was reading very well at kind of 5th grade level. And in order to be able to exercise her in the areas assessed as deficit, they had to move her into a content environment that bored her, that didn't stay challenging to her at her interest level. And so the thing went into a dark spiral, even though it was paired up at an assessment level. The assessments couldn't be made to correspond with instructional materials that could cover both the child's interests, what's relevant and engaging to them, at the same time exercise them in the area of their greatest need.
Yeah, that's too good of an example.
Yeah. We're almost out of time again.
Too interesting a topic.
It is.
Too rich, really.
Too rich. You know, one of the things that I get from Dr. Whitehurst and Dr. Lyon is that, you know, they seem to be more frustrated than you are with how to turn the kind of national teacher-parent paradigms about reading into recognizing the fact that this isn't like teaching anything else.
Yeah.
We're we're talking about impressing into the brains of these children a technology, just like a CD player can only be, a CD can only be played on a CD player with the right decoder in it, and a DVD can only play with the right decoder in it, and a web page can only be played on a browser. There's a correspondence between reading this code and developing this kind of inner technology to deal with it that is a technological process that does not lend itself to teaching approaches that don't fundamentally recognize that it is a technological process with a series of steps of development that aren't natural.
Yeah. Well, you know, I couldn't, as you know, really speak to the difference in our frustration levels on that.
No, I only mean to bring it up in the sense that I think what we're doing here with the Children of the Code is trying to bring about this reframe of how people think about the challenge of reading, from it being this kind of this long time wisdom was that this is something somehow natural. To it's not only radically unnatural, it's technological, and there's a series of very specific developmental challenges that the brain has to go through in order to be able to do it. And if we don't meet children in each of those different steps, that we're actually damaging them.
Well, I agree with all that, and I know, you know, getting back to your other question just briefly, I know that Dr. Whitehurst and Dr. Lyon and I certainly agree on that. And one thing that I think has masked the failure of public education to do a better job is the, 55 or 60% or so of kids that will learn to read regardless. And I think that in...
Well, that doesn't really jive with the NAEP, does it?
Well, I throw those numbers out broadly, but it does if you take it as the
basic level. Yes, but if we say the difference between basic and proficiency is a fundamentally important one, that basic isn't good enough.
Right. My point is that too often schools and teachers and districts have gotten by with ineffective, non-research based, fuzzy programs,
right,
because there are a certain percentage of kids that they're learning despite the poor instruction.
Yes, exactly, right.
And so, but too often, especially in some areas, they'll say, "Oh, we're doing fine because we're best in the state," even when best in the state is not very.
Yeah, I've talked to other experts who say we're doing fine because we're second in the world.
Right.
Like the fact that so many millions of children are having their lives trashed by this isn't important if we're second in the world or we're first in the state.
Right. But I think I definitely think that reading first, and specifically reading first, and more broadly scientifically based reading instruction is showing that we're really aiming right now first and foremost on the kids that absolutely everything you do with them in the classroom is important. Every day is important. No time can be wasted. And to try to shake up the establishment in that regard, and shaking it up is exactly what we're doing. In other words, if you kind of look at the amount of pushback as testament to trying to change the status quo, you could say we're definitely changing the status quo. Good.
Okay. Well, we are out of time. There's two other brief conversations I'd like to have with you, and I can do that by email. One is. I'd like to set up a video interview with you and go over some of this and extend this conversation in your office the next time we're in Washington, which I expect will be first quarter next year. Are you open to that?
First quarter next year?
Yeah.
Yeah, by all means. I don't have any big travel plans then.
Okay. And the second thing I want to explore is we're spreading out our funding for the project so that we're not polarized by any particular group. One of the people that Russ suggested, or one of the source of funds in the education department that Russ suggested, was funds associated with your project, or that you might know other people that would see the Children of the Code, which is going to be both college and DVD series for professional development, but also the broadcast for national PBS, as something that's mission aligned with what you're doing.
Right. I'll tell you, on the funding one, my program alone, I think there's no chance at all. Which
Okay.
again, if I were more politic, I'd give you a longer, flowery
That's
answer.
okay. I
But
appreciate the short.
I see no way, just knowing what I know about the requirements that all of our funds go through. I think the department as a whole, perhaps there are many buckets that I'm either only vaguely aware of or unaware of, but from the Reading First coffers, it's an absolute non-starter.
Okay.
And then I'm not even sure where to suggest beyond, Reading First, other than, the obvious, which is the program or the kind of effort that you're doing seems to be, just perfect in of trying to. I mean, when I saw your list of people that you'd already interviewed or were set to interview, it was, of course, it was the who's who of the whole the whole field. But I don't have any good leads on how to get funding for it from this building.
Okay. Good. Well, I appreciate that very much. I appreciate your straightforward clarity.
Sure.
I appreciated that in all of our talk time. And I'll be in touch about arranging a Washington visit when we get scheduled up for that next window.
Super. I will be here.
Okay.
Barring any unforeseen events.
Thank you so much, sir.
My pleasure. I enjoy talking about it.
Okay. Take care. Bye.
Bye.